in China, brought to you by the Institute of Export and International Trade's Export Control Profession. My name is William Barnes-Graham and I am the Senior Content Editor at the Institute. And I will be shortly joined by today's speaker, Arne Mielken. Hi Arne, how are you? How's it been so far this year for you?
Oh, it's an exciting roller coaster, I must say. Thank you very much for allowing me to be here. It's very exciting, so I'm eager to get started. But William, you take it away.
Great, Arne, great to have you. Just so everyone knows, Arne is an accredited customs and export control practitioner, as well as a member of the Export Control Profession Board. He has advised and trained clients across many sectors on dual use and military export controls and sanctions, as well as advising on EU, UK, and US and Chinese export controls. Many of you may have read Arne's article in the IOE Daily Bulletin this week about the draft export control law in China. New legislation that's been in the works for a few years and which could have a significant impact on firms trading with China. You may also have read several of the reports around new Chinese export controls and sanctions against the US in particular in recent times. So plenty for us to get into today. Before all that though, we're delighted to have Roger Arfi, Chair of the Export Control Profession, who is here with us again today. Roger, how are you?
I'm great, thank you, Will. Looking forward to this webinar.
Fantastic. And if we move on to the next slide. So there's just some more information about Arne there again, and on to the next slide. And Roger, you're going to just do a couple of slides just talking about the export control profession. So over to you, Roger.
Thanks very much, Will. Yeah, don't want to take up too much of Arne's time, but I just want to introduce the export control profession to those of you who haven't come across it before. As it says here, we're the only professional body in the UK, especially for export control personnel. It was created about 2 years ago and is led by export control specialists. We're here to promote professional development and professional recognition of export control staff. So we do that by providing and supporting training and development opportunities, of course, like today's webinar. We also provide courses. The IOE is running a series of courses called Introduction to Export Licensing Controls in a virtual classroom. This is running monthly and the next one is in early February. If you want to know more about that, go to the IOE website. We're also partners with other organisations such as the ECJU, ADS and Content Enablers, and they provide courses and events. We also provide resources to enable increased compliance such as communications, network events and a very active helpline. Export control professionals are recognised by post-nominal letters, MIEXCP or Associate Member of the Export Control Profession. And if you want more information, do visit at www.exportcontrolprofession.co.uk. If you'd like to move on to the next slide, please. I just want to talk to you very briefly about an online training offer that we've got. The IOE, the Export Control Profession and Content Enablers have got a free introductory offer to some of Content Enablers materials. You can access the Foundations of US Export Control Compliance for UK Practitioners course free for the first 30 days. Instead of having to subscribe, you get free access for 30 days. This also gives you access to 11 on-demand Compliance 2020 webinars and the Compliance 2021 kickoff event, which were webinars set up by Content Enablers. If you sign up for the free offer, you can cancel at any time for up to 30 days for no charge, or you can continue the annual subscription at less than £20 a month. And there, if you do that, you'll get your CPD unit from the Institute for completing the course. You'll get 12 months access to course updates and other continuous learning opportunities, including exclusive access to all 11 upcoming Compliance 2021 events. I hope that you'll take advantage of this offer to see what the IOE, the ECP and content enablers are providing, and to join our community of subscribers. There's more information on the ECP website if you look for trade compliance training. So plug over, let's get on with the program, and I'll pass you back to Will. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you very much. Some useful resources there indeed. So I'm just going to launch a poll quickly before handing over to Arne, and this is just a quick poll to find out a little bit more about you. So we are asking which sector best describes your business, and we have options there including export and importer, consultant, advisor, financial services, freight transport, and other. While you are answering that, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Firstly, you can contact me with any comments or questions using the question panel on the control window to the right-hand side of your screen. We've already had a fair few questions come in, but please do bear in mind that we won't be able to get through everything today. And Arne's presentation, there's a lot of information in there as well. So we'll hopefully get to a couple of questions, but we can't guarantee loads today, I'm afraid. Secondly, you will receive access to today's slide pack and a recording of today's webinar in a follow-up email, which we will be sending over the next day or so. So, of course, please do listen in to today's presentation as much as you can. So just a few more seconds for people to answer that poll. I'll give you a mini countdown. 3, 2, 1. And to share the results, so we have over half of you are exporters or importers, a fair few consultants, advisors, a fair few freight and transport companies, and yeah, a few others as well. But hopefully this webinar will be of interest to all of you. And without any further ado, on to the next slide, we will have Arne Mielken. Arne, over to you.
Thank you so much, Will, and thanks, Roger, for the introduction and also the great offer with content enablers. So I mean, I'm signed up, so I hope a lot of people will see you there. Well, look, as if we wouldn't be occupied enough with the various things that we deal with here in the UK, how on earth are we going to absorb this thing happening over on the other side? In China. So I'm here to talk to you about the exciting new law that has come into force, and we nearly missed it. Some of us, of course, know it, but a few missed it. So the new export control law and why it matters to us. Well, I am German myself, a part of me at least, and so I know the Germans are all hot about it, so I thought it's time we ought to talk about it too. Now we have a lot of people on the line, so I'm so grateful that the topic is interesting for you too. Now, I get to talk in the ECP board, the Export Control Profession Board, a lot about this topic. Here is what I can share with you. I'm glad enough, we'll go to the next slide, please. I'm glad enough to do that. What we are going to talk about is a lot. There's a lot of information, so I need to get going. Bit of background, bit of geopolitical context without being controversial, I promise, in my usual style. Then a look at the actual text, the law, what's in it, how is it structured? And then, of course, the question, who is affected? Is it UK really, or is it only the Chinese? And how does it matter to us? How do the Chinese control exports? What's the licensing process? And then, some of the individual issues based on the geopolitical comments, and then some conclusions and on to your question. So packed, full packed. So let's go. Go to the next one. I have to make a small disclaimer. We have less than 1 hour. There is much more to say, and I am, of course, giving in some parts my opinion because it's all in Chinese. I don't speak Chinese, and there are a lot of things we can say, and there are a few things we can't say, and so sometimes I have to tell you what I think. So please take it for what it's worth. It's what I think and what literature tells me, what opinions tell me, but for all, as always, you need to diversify your sources and you need to look at the legal text to get the proper advice and follow the instructions of the, you know the rest. All right, let's go to the next slide, please, and get started. So what's important here is that this is a consolidated Chinese export control law, the first uniform export control law. We did have export control provisions in various places. Now we bring together, amongst others, dual-use items, plus military products and nuclear materials in one consolidated law. And that is relevant because we do that in the EU, we do that in the UK, and now China in the US as well, and now China follows suit. The first draft goes already back to 2017 by the Ministry of Commerce. Then it all has to go through the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. And in last year, the second draft was published. So we had a first one, we all got shocked. Then there were public consultation, we got a second draft, and now the text is approved or was approved in October, and approved in October, entered into force in 2 months later. So can you imagine that? It's quite crazy. Now, there are some, when looking at the law and the timing of the law, cannot help but think that this has been designed in a little bit part in a way to make a comment about the treatment of China by the US. And maybe to say, well, if the US have this China as this export control law, we ought to have some export control law as well. Look at the next slide, you will see what I mean. This is now more about the geopolitical context very quickly, so we get to the text. So it's important, I think, looking at the next slide, that we put this into the political context, right? Then, because China could have done that a long time ago, why now? So by the end of 2020, we had 4 years of tensions with the US. This is nothing new or nothing controversial, it's just what it is, right? For 4 years in a tariff trade war, China had been engulfed with the US. We also see that the strategy of the US to limit the influence of China in the US, if I may be so frank to say, has seen various instruments being activated, from the Section 301 investigation and tariff to the Huawei entity listing and the temporary general license removal. The next slide will go into this in more detail. So you can read here and see that why I have copied this. It comes from the Bureau of Industry and Strategy in the US, and it says that this US BIS has concluded that Huawei is engaged in activity that are contrary to the US national security or foreign policy interests. So a direct quote from BIS saying that what a Chinese company is doing is against the so-called national security interests of the US. So this then prompted a listing in the entity list of not only Huawei itself, but also all affiliates outside the US. And that includes Huawei in the UK, in Europe, in Switzerland, across the world. And that restricts the ability to Huawei to execute and play on the international scene. So next slide, please. Let's move on. Then, of course, this doesn't stop here with one company. There is this whole argument about Hong Kong and mainland China now being treated as two separate destinations under US law for export control purposes. And that, of course, flies against the idea of the Chinese government. And that also means that certain items subject to the American export controls, EAR, do now require an individual validated license for export from the US to Hong Kong. But now, due to the extraterrestrial nature, you will also require a license for the re-export from Hong Kong to China. So you see, there is a lot that the US is doing to exercise influence in China. Carrying on. This then plays into many other areas, including the likes of TikTok and WeChat. And now we have just in January, we had an executive order addressing the threat posed by applications and software developers controlled by Chinese companies. Moving on right away. And then while this is all happening between the US and China, the EU has been active as well and got a system upgrade late last year with a reformed dual-use regulation, and which now, interestingly, addresses the risk of violations of human rights associated with the trade of cyber surveillance, and most importantly, that can be done without prior agreement at multilateral level. So reform at European level. The next slide will show you what we did in the UK. UK left the European Union and now operates an independent sanctions and export control regime. And one of the first statements of the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab was to make a comment about the human rights situation in China. So all of that to say that a British company in the next slide you will see this, finds itself at different ends, at a situation which you could call crossfire of world powers. There is the conflict between the US and China, which now may quieten down, we will see, or not. On the other hand, you have the EU export control reform, and we have our own standalone export control and sanctions regime. All of this now impacts importers and exporters around the world. So in that context, the next slide will show you we are entering the debate about the China export control law. Here is the time slide, and you will see at the end of this, we have the 1st of December 2020. This has come into force, and now what do we do with it? So let's take a look at the law. In the next slide, we'll see it. We're doing a post. Will, go for it.
Yeah, so just going to give Arne a quick break because obviously he's getting through quite a lot today. So just to find out again a little bit more about our audience, why does Chinese export control law interest you? And the options there are: we import Chinese controlled items, we are a Chinese exporter, we send employees to China, or general interest. And as mentioned earlier, we have had a few questions in already. So Arne, if I may, I'll ask you one of his questions during this poll. So a question here from Eric, who's asked: we are a UK company and we import goods from China, but don't know if they are controlled or not. What do you recommend we do to prepare ourselves for the new law?
Oh, that's a really good question. So we need to go further onto the slide, so I show you how you can figure out if they're controlled or not with the controlled list and the various provisions for it, as far as we know. But Will, you're right, it's not all clear yet, right? So we have the basic law, it's like a framework law. We now are waiting for more guidance. We have lists, there are lists in Chinese law right now. They would apply right now, so you can orientate yourself with these apply until they get replaced by a consolidated list. One of the steps that you can always do, given that that there is international law or international agreement, you can always see if these products would be controlled in the UK. If you were to export them, that gives you an indication. Now, it's not a foolproof say that this will apply in China because the rules are different, but it gives you a good indication. So first of all, really think about would this attract a control in the UK? The UK follows international regime, so that's a good indication. If you see that you would find you are controlled in the UK, then maybe that would be an idea to think that you might also be controlled by the Chinese export control law. And given that China and the US are kind of on a tit for tat with this, if it was controlled in the US, chances are it's controlled in China as well. So that would be one of the things I would think about. Getting set up for export controls is always a good thing when you think that you are concerned by the rules, and that could involve classifying your product for export control purposes, finding out the rating, but also considering the use of an ICP, which is internal compliance program, as appropriate.
Great, thank you, Arne. So look at the UK laws first as an indicator, then possibly US, but we shall find out more later on in the presentation in reference to that question. So just to close the poll and show the results. So interestingly enough, 62% are here for general interest. It is a generally interesting topic, but we also have 21% here who import Chinese controlled goods and 13% who are Chinese exporters. But anywho, back to you, Arne.
Well, that's wonderful. So we've got a good mix, and that's exciting. So let's take a look and deep dive a little bit into this with the next slides. Thank you, Will, for stopping me here. I could take a breath. Next slide, please. So here it is, guys. That is it. So you can test your Chinese. I have to rely on a translation, an official translation that was given to me. There are only, if you wish, or even 49 articles. There are 5 chapters: general provisions, control policies, control lists, and control measures. So you can imagine where you have to go for your list. It will be chapter 2. Then it's about regulation, and regulation means enforcement and monitoring. And then we go to the legal liability, and the legal liability is all about the sanctions regulation and what to do if you do not comply. what will be the fine, what will be the consequences. And then there are supplementary provisions, and you can see how the law is kind of structured. All right, so let's pick some of the issues. Now, I'm aware because of time, we will not be able to go through all of the issues, so I appreciate that. But you know, we'll have a go. So let's go to the next slide. So what law are we talking about? How does this final version now look? I told you there was a draft 1 where we all got into shock, and then draft 2 we were relieved again. It is because the extraterrestrial powers, and if you know export control, you know extraterrestrial is a problem. It is really a problem for businesses. We were fearful that draft 1, which had extraterrestrial powers and controls similar to the US in there, would make it into draft 2. And can you imagine what that would mean to UK companies that would import controlled items from China and then export them onto America? Can you imagine? So we are pleased to say that in this final version, draft 2, which is a adjusted way of this extraterrestrial control, has made it into the law. And so now the ECL largely corresponds to the second draft. Let's take a closer look into the next slide, please. Despite the fact that we have this law now, there are still a lot, because it's a framework law, there are still a lot of terms that are used and issues that need more clarity in order for us to do anything with. So the legal terms need to be specified in required guidance. We are awaiting accompanying ordinances, administrative regulations and guidelines. And the approval criteria and the scope of the list are still very unclear. So I'm afraid to say that there are a lot of ambiguities which make a targeted presentation and preparation, even for companies at the moment, quite difficult, which is why I can understand you have a general interest, because quite frankly, what to prepare if it is not 100% clear. But we thought it's important that you get this update anyway. Let's move to the next one, please. So what we do have is now a consolidated framework. Previous export control law was completely split and targeted into different laws. So we had if export control reference in the Foreign Trade Act, in the Customs Act, there were administrative regulations, there was an arm export regulation, nuclear export regulation, all of that had been drafted, and so the export control legislation was scattered across multiple laws, and it was quite frankly impossible to get one consolidated regime. That has now stopped. So we move to the next slide, please. We also have now consolidated powers, at least sort of. We have now a clear structure. When before multiple agencies were involved, now there is a much more clarity. We have a clear legal and investigative powers and enforcement for these Chinese export controls. The key agencies are MOFCOM, the State Administration for Science, Technology and Industry, and then we have also the Ministry of National Defense. Then there are also quite a few other authorities that play part, but they all have a more decisive role, and we know who the leadership in this whole thing is. Interestingly, the Central Military Commission has also got a quite important key role in enforcing, implementing, interpreting this new law. Let's move to the next slide, please. So here we have clarity on who is in charge. This is on Article 5. The departments of the State Council and the Central Military Commission that perform the export controls function, collectively known as the State Export Controls Administrative Departments. We are introducing the concept of the SECADs. They are responsible for the task relating to this law. And then they outsource, if you wish, implementation and enforcement to other commissions. But it is all coming from the SECAD. And that's important because that is the point of contact for authorities that probably are listening to this webinar as well as to some traders as well. All right, so we have clarity of who's in charge, so that's good. Next. We then are looking into the question of what kind of controls are we having here, and is this in line with international obligations? So the question is, how far does China adhere to the international regimes that the UK has signed up and that the EU and that the US have signed up? Well, China has international non-proliferation obligations, to be very sure. They've signed up to non-proliferation treaty. They're also part of the Chemicals Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention. So that clearly is part of this export control law. Up next please. However, we do see that China is not part of many international export control systems. Now that's to us, of course, regrettable, because again, planning is made difficult because there is no commitment by China to implement what the Wassenaar agreement, what the Wassenaar group now agrees would be forcibly next year in the China export control laws, would be too great, right? But unfortunately, China has not signed up to the Australia group, nor the Zanga Committee, nor the Missile Technology Control Regime. It did sign up to the Nuclear Suppliers Group, so that's good. Most importantly, however, for us, it's not part of the Wassenaar Agreement on export controls and dual-use technology. So it's unclear whether China is ready to comply to other national control regimes. But in my opinion, having a consolidated ECL is also a very good step because it increases transparency and makes it more comparable with other existing regimes. The next slide does show you that China is applying ammunitions list in the Wassenaar Agreement, and is applying parts of the MTCR, the equipment and software related parts. So, you know, there is good progress. I did not see or do not know about the dual use list that could be similar to what we know as the Annex 1 of the EU dual use regulation, or our comparable UK consolidated list of dual use item. In particular, they do have something on the military. Okay, up next. So having a quick brushstroke over this law, now the question is, who is actually affected by it, right? Is it UK companies? Is it why should we care? Yeah, is another way of saying it. Let's have a closer look at that. So here we are introducing a new term. We are introducing the name of export operator. And that one's mentioned 32 times. But if you are a fan of EU legislation, and then you like the definitions in the beginning of every EU law, right? And I'm a fan of defining stuff I refer to in law. Unfortunately, I did not really find export operator means this. 32 times the law talks about it, but doesn't define it. So we looked at the previous version and we found that what we have here is a business operator that is a citizen, legal representative, or other organization engaged in exporting controlled items in accordance with the rules of laws and administrators' regulations. So in a previous version, that's what we found. Now we have a similar text in Article 2, but what's key here is we are talking about normal citizens, we are talking about legal representatives, and we are talking about business organization. That's everyone. Everyone who is in China and who exports is an export operator and falls under this law. So I think it's more like an exporter under UK and EU law. And many of the requirements, and that's crucial because many of the requirements and rules and fines are linked to the concept of export operator. It's basically anyone who exports controlled goods from China within the meaning of the law. All right, next up. So this is the big one, right? That's the big question. Will UK importers actually be affected? My view is yes, you will be. Otherwise, why would we be having this webinar? Why? Because there is a certain amount of extraterritorial validity and also liability. I will show you in a moment. What does this mean? It means that the reaches of China export control law go as far as the UK. There are also, of course, the end-use provisions, which require you to undertake end-use commitments. You might have to issue end-use certificates to Chinese companies. And of course, if you are found to be going against this law, you might end up being blacklisted. Now, that is a harsh thing to say, and I don't think it's ever going to happen, but it could. Let's move on.
And on that note, it's time for a poll, a bit of suspense going into the next section. So this next poll is asking, just again to find out more about you, do you import items that are now controlled by China's new regulations? I'll give you a few seconds to answer that. A question in from Tristan, though, Arne.
Yeah, ready.
Who's asked, I mean, obviously you're talking about the translated copy of the PRC export control law, which you've been working off. Where can people find translations or information around the law?
Yeah, so there at the moment you can definitely go to the website of MOFCOM. So MOFCOM provides a very good service, in fact, because they provide unofficial translations as well. So it's still unofficial, but it's better than nothing. And so on MOFCOM you will find the latest updates on this. And you know, like you do with all legislators, they have provisions for newsletter signups. And so, like we have with gov.uk, where we go for all our export-related, control-related news and updates, they would be a very good point to start. But of course, there are other operators and also stakeholders that offer interpretation services. There are law firms, there are you know, various consultants and whatnot, many with I cooperate to help me prepare for this session. And they give you, what's good about this, they don't just give you the text, but they give you what it means in the Chinese context, and they allow you to ask questions. So MOFCOM is the official source. This is where you should go for all your official information, and then anything around the edges is a bonus. And we will, of course, to the extent that we can in the export control profession, support you as well.
Great, thank you, Arne. Just to close that poll, and so 56% aren't sure about whether the import items which will now be controlled by the regulations. So that's perhaps highlighting the importance of webinars such as this. 32% are pretty sure they don't, and 12% already know that they do. So back to you, Arne.
And it's not surprising, right? And you will see in a moment the lists are not published. So how will you know, right? They're not published, but when they're published, we are in a better position because we have this webinar to think about the context of it, right? So it won't come as a total surprise. So how are the items controlled? Let's look at it. And you know, you've got to understand, I will go with what the law says. That's what matters. That's all I can say right now. I can't make up what the Chinese decision maker will decide, right? What I can tell you from the law is that it's foreseen in 4 ways, right? First, we have, and this is already a big progress because we can see that this follows a structure we are familiar with. Controls based on a goods list. Hallelujah, that's good, right? One list is better than many lists. But then we have something called a temporary control list. And if you look at the legislation, you'll see what I mean. So that is an interesting concept because can we have temporary control lists? I'm not sure. What about the catch-all rule? Don't we all like a bit of a catch-all rule? I like a catch-all rule, so we will look at that catch-all rule. And then something interesting, intervention when needed. I would call it whenever needed. So let's look at these 4 in a bit more detail. Now I need to look into my notes here because there's quite a lot of detail. So we're not going to click, we're going to stay with this. The first one is the control list. So that's Article 9. The ECL foresees different lists for controlled items. So there might not be just one list in the future coming out, but multiple. They will be organized by groups. In addition to the classic goods list, there will also be a controlled temporary list. And this list, so these lists, these goods and lists and controlled temporary control list, they should be created and updated by the Chinese authorities in the future. I'm currently not aware that this list exists. So if you look into Article 9, you will see this in more detail. There are, of course, already some current lists. What is the challenge now with these lists that are about to come out? Well, we have an existing goods list for military items, for nuclear items, and that should, of course, be incorporated into this new list that is being created. There are 2 key challenges here with these lists. Because China is not part of the Wassenaar arrangement, we're talking dual use items now, it's unclear if all of these dual use items that we are used to will make it, so take on crypto or whatnot, will make it into their dual use list. And we also don't know what scope this would have. Fingers crossed, we will see a list we are familiar with. And of course, the second challenge, as you can imagine, will be this temporary control, because it gives flexibility to the legislator. Well, this is a challenge because how do you plan, right? So goods can be now under this temporary control, although limited in duration of a maximum of 2 years. Goods can be easily moved onto this list. Goods should be included in the temporary list if it is necessary, and now I quote from the law, that's why I'm reading off here to make sure I'm not making this wrong, telling you wrong. The maintenance of national security and national interests and the performance of anti-proliferation and other international obligations. What's notable here? I think anti-proliferation we have no issue with. What is notable here is the word national security, in my opinion. Why? Because what is national security? What is the interest, the national security interest of a country? And did not the US justify a lot of its action based on just that, national security? So what is the meaning of national security? Because that triggers incorporation of a product in a temporary list. That's where I have to stop. I can't say more. Okay, so that's the challenge of the list. Move on to the stay don't touch, go back. Sorry, move on to 3, the catch-all rule. The catch-all rule regulation is linked to the use of the goods or the relevant risk. So the risks that are in the legislation, and again I have to quote here, are endangering national security and national interests, being used for the design, development, production of use of weapons of mass destruction and the delivery of vehicles, or being used for terrorist purposes. That's your catch-all clause. Is it comparable with that of the UK or the European law? That's for us to discuss another time. What I notice here are 2 things. Number 1, national security triggers the catch-all clause, meaning as soon as it is found that it impacts the national security of China, which is not defined, you have an export control obligation and terrorist use, of course. Now, here is another difference with our law. It includes that the exporter is aware of these things happening. So if the exporter is aware, then this triggers a control. But here is the new thing. If the exporter should have known that this is against the interest of national security, if the exporter should have known, then this automatically gets triggered as well. Okay, and of course the notification of a competent authority also triggers this control. And the final 4th point you see here is intervene whenever needed. The ECL also sees the possibility of a specific intervention when one of the following reasons is given. Guess what? National security, national interests, or weapons of mass destruction. So here we have national security and national interests. So that may mean we're triggering whenever we want. Does it? Up to us to debate. Now we can go to the licensing process, please. Next slide, please. Okay, and the next one straight away. So I found that very interesting, and I thought I'd share it with you, and I hope you don't mind, because this concept of national security is a very, very interesting one. So licensing, how do we license? Well, the criteria are set. So we do know the licensing will be subject to a set of criteria. We have those 2 in the UK. But for China, licenses will be granted by the committee, as we've said, according to these following one. And what is the first one? National security and national interests, international obligation. But now we are also talking about the type of export that out of the sudden matters. Of course, it's not different from us. In fact, sensitivity of the items, I think we are all clear with that. Destination of the item, yes, of course. Destination, country or region of export, end use and end user. Credit record of the export operator. Is that something we control in the UK? Not so sure. Other factors provided in laws and administrative regulations. What is that? Okay, all right, okay. So this might mean that getting a license is considered against these criteria, and we are not quite sure what all of these terms mean. However, you see that whenever you trigger one of those, you might be refused a license. Let's go to the next slide, please. The ECL lists several competent authorities referred to as the State Export Control Administrative Departments. I've already mentioned here. You have them. The key ones, as I said, they group both together. So the ones that will be making a decision are on the policy and the direction of travel is the highest administrative body of China, the State Council of the People's Republic of China, and the Central Military Commission, the highest military command body of China. And the competent authorities for applications will be the State Administrative Department for the export control over dual-use items and then over military items. And then there might be differences within that as well. So moving on straight away. So what documents do you need to submit will be your next question. Well, I'm sorry, I can't tell you because we only have Article 15 right now, and that means who needs to submit to whom, right? So export operators, now you know it's SECAD that you need to submit to, and what you need to put, of course, is, no surprise, end user statements, end use undertaking, and user undertaking, right, of the controlled items. So this is where you guys in the UK, or we in the UK, I should say, come into play and have to complete a Chinese document in Chinese. So good luck with that, and also certification of certified documents might be required, and whatever is needed will be specified in the application. That's all we can say because Article 15 is not more specific. Therefore, there more guidance is expected. All right, so but what it means is that we will have an array of more documents that we need to think about. Let's go to the next slide, please. So having talked about the licensing process and about the scope and about what are operators and what export operators and so on, let's look at some of the key individual issues that I think we ought to talk about. And it's the key question on people's mind, right? The first question is, what about extraterritorial controls? And let me explain, right? What have I done here? I've taken it from the US EAR law, right? And what does the US say? What is extraterrestrial control? Because we don't know that in the UK. We know it from America, and it impacts us a lot. The actual shipment, transmission of an item subject to the export control regulation of the US from one foreign country to another foreign country, UK to Germany, UK to Russia, right? Including sending or taking of items to and from such countries in such manner. That also relates to technology, right? From a foreign person to another in a foreign country. So a conversation between a British and an Irish about US controls in Germany can trigger all sorts of US controls. So meaning you need to go to the US department and make an application. Why do you think I'm telling you that? What if China said the same thing? What if China said, you know what, if the US can do it, we can do it? You will go to MOFCOM. You will make a customs declaration, an export control application. Yes, why? Because extraterrestrial apply can. So you can find yourself making a declaration to BIS and to MOFCOM at the same time. Can you do that? Do you want to do that? So that was in draft number 1. Let's take the next slide. Look at the minus. That was draft 1. That's out now. Article 64 for controlled items or foreign products which contain items controlled by China with values thereof or above the designated proportion, US de minimis rule. The law shall apply to export of such items or products from overseas to another foreign countries. That is your extraterrestrial control a la US. And that would have made, I would not even want to speculate what that would mean. We are lucky, we are thankful that there is Article 45 now. But reading between the lines, we see this. The transit, the trans-shipment, and the through shipment re-export of any controlled items or export of any controlled items from bonded areas, export processing zones, and other areas specifically regulated by customs and regulated bonded places, such as regulated export warehouses and bonded logistics centers, shall be governed by the applicable provisions of the law. Okay, and that means what? That means that we control in China, but when there are bonded areas that are not subject to the normal rules of the land, that also is in scope of the Chinese export control law. So no longer all of the UK, but specific areas of the UK that operate outside the normal legislative framework. Can you guys think of any area in the UK now or in the future that might be particularly impacted by that? Go to the next slide. Could I be more dramatic than that? Could I be more dramatic? I don't think I could, because look at this. We are going for free ports. We are creating 10 free ports. So I am asking the question, is this considered an area in which Chinese export controls would apply? Because this is the way where we would operate outside the normal parameters of a customs control. So if you are moving controlled goods into China, into a UK free zone, and you try to move it outside, would Chinese export control law apply to you? But let's discuss it some other time. I think we should ought to talk about it. On we go to the next, please. So please watch out what this means. Okay, we have now weakened re-export requirements, but there is more to think about. So we have this bonded zone situation. By the way, Will, I'm mindful of the time. I've got this. The consequences could be quite significant because, as I will show you in a moment, there are bigger liability concerns here. There are provisions in this where it is specifically provided for that agents such as freight forwarders in China, though, and third parties would also be covered by this law. We also have the liability for foreign companies or persons that engage in activities that are unlawful according to this law to be considered as as violating the law. And the consequences can be severe because in the worst case, you will find yourself blacklisted. There is a specific provision in the law that allows to do that. You might also have it might be a provision for a third party like a freight forwarder, like an express carrier, like a shipper, like an attorney, because it goes to everyone, like a consultant to provide services to these exporters. You might also find yourself in being added to this new unreliable entity list, which was published recently. And of course, we also have, since the beginning of the year, the first law of the year was a new China blocking regulations, which we know from the EU, blocking the efforts of the US to undermine the trade with Iran and Cuba. We now have the similar blocking regulation in China, which allows Chinese companies, or which prohibits, I should say, Chinese companies from executing operations made by foreign powers that are against the national interests of China. So if you try to apply for a license to re-export products from Hong Kong to China, then you will need to deal with both the American requirements and the Chinese requirements under the blocking regulation. And that is a challenge, I should say. I'd love to discuss. Go to the next slide. So what about deemed exports, right? That's the next thing in the US. We have on the left this. Export means a release of or otherwise transferring technology or source code to a foreign person. So now we are talking about deemed export, no goods, no tangible goods. Now we are talking about knowledge and technology that is being moved on the clouds and whatnot. And yes, we have that too in China. The term controlled item includes technical information and other related data of items. So on extraterrestrial, we can see an easement, but deemed export we have, for sure we have. Okay, next slide, please. What's the consequence of that? It means the transfer of controlled goods from Chinese person, natural or legal, to foreign person, even within China, would be considered an export controlled activity. And that is relevant for companies. That's why we asked that question, undertaking research or development in China. Under certain circumstances, even with purely domestic Chinese products, appropriate authorizations would need to be obtained as soon as a foreigner participates. So if you're thinking about a trip to China, talking about things that might impact Chinese national security, you ought to pay attention to this. So we don't know at this point if we can conclude that Chinese person sharing such information in the UK in projects related to China controlled goods are included. I would think so, but we need to be careful making interpretations when we just don't know. I would expect the scope to be wide, and I would therefore think that Chinese people or Chinese employees which have knowledge of goods that are currently controlled ought to be thinking about what that means in practice when you go into your next technical engineering meeting to discuss sensitive controlled items. All right, next up. Yep, then we go to end use. Oh, I need to speed up. Oh my goodness, I want 2 more hours, please. End use obligations. 3 obligations, please. Obligation to submit, obligation not to alter, and the reporting obligation. So you must submit an end use obligation. So you would expect in the UK to receive a request for certification for an undertaking like we do too. You need to certify the end user and the end use controlled items. And that will need to be certified. These documents, these certification documents, shall be issued by national or local government agency in place where end user or end users are located. So this is a clear mandate for the DIT, the Department of International Trade in the UK. They would need to stamp and approve that that is so, and that is the only way we're going to get end users to be end use statements to be accepted in China. That's how I read this, but again, I'm always open for discussion. Then once the UK DIT has certified that you are a good importer and you are really who you are and you are not sending this off to someone undesired, then you cannot alter this. If you alter this, you find yourself in trouble. There is reporting obligations as well. Okay, and then of course these documents will be risk assessed by the SECAD. All right, moving on right away. There's a blacklist. I have put you here who goes onto the blacklist if you violate the requirements regarding the management of end users and end users, if you endanger national security or the national interest, or use controlled items for terrorist purposes. So you can see the red thread is there. Whenever it's against China's national interest, you might be put on a blacklist. All right, so don't endanger national security. Go on. Consequences of blacklisting: the export operator will not be allowed to do business with listed persons. So it is up to the Chinese exporter to know who's on the list, but equally it is important for you to know who's on this list, right? Because you might be engaging without knowing it with people who are on the Chinese list, and then you are importing from China and controlled goods. That might be a problem. Commercial transaction can also be prohibited by the authorities. Violation against this has far-reaching consequences for export operators, and consequences are fines up to 20 times the amount of the offense, and there's also a possibility of the denial of export privileges up to 5 years. Moving on straight away, because time is running. We also have special cases with this, and there is an unreliable entity list, and the blocking statutes that could fill another whole hour. So if you're interested in that, you need to start lobbying Will and Roger, because then we can see each other again and we can talk about that. Next up. There are, of course, other matters to talk about, like an ICP is not going to be mandatory, but it is going to be recommended. It might lead to simplification, so you might want to look into that. And I could talk about fines and punishment, but that would scare us way too much. Go to the next slide. We conclude. Good. Let's conclude very quickly. Next slide, please. So the impact, in conclusion, the impact depends on what you do, right, and who you are. So companies exporting from China, possibly with the UK parent company or your suppliers, will have a different impact than companies acting as importers in the UK with Chinese controlled goods and or end user of these. So as hopefully you understand what it means and how you are impacted in different ways. And then of course, if you have UK employees that work in China, that matters. And even foreign companies may be controlled from China. Exporters from China are so-called export operators, and they have obligation as outlined in the law and can be penalized for violation. In my personal opinion, I think the tit for tat with the US has become quite clear, as the US controls national security and so does China now. On to the next slide. There's your poll, Will. Quick.
Right, thank you, Arne. Very comprehensive presentation and very in just 3 hours. So thank you so much for that presentation. Just one last question for you as we get into questions from you. This one's asking, do you import or handle controlled items from the USA under export license, e.g. ITAR or EAR? Yes, no, not sure. The options. And let's get into just a couple of questions before the hour is up. We've had a few people asking about a scenario where, say, you're importing parts from the US and China, assembling them all into goods in the UK to finish a product to then export somewhere else. Marta is one of the people asking this, and she asks, we know how to apply for licenses in the UK in this scenario. We have a SPI account. We are controlling our export out of the UK. Do we need to do anything else?
Well, look, the fact that you are in SPI indicates to me that you are dealing with controlled items, right? Otherwise, why would you have a SPI account? So you are clearly in the realm of export controlled items. You get licenses, and so that conjures up the idea that you might be subject to US export controls as well, because imagining you bring in components and you can transport this, you create a product that you then export out of the UK, and that product is export controls. It could very well be, I'm guessing of course, that you are importing controlled items that are subject to the EAR or even worse, ITAR, in which case you would have obligations under the US law. Now, if you then import controlled items from China, you will have obligations under the Chinese law. And that would require you to do imports and end user statements. And of course, in a paradox, in a way, it might be, you might find yourself in a situation where you need to adhere to US regulations and Chinese regulations, export control regulations, and they are at odds with each other. And that is the worst position, because you can't satisfy one without violating the other. And if you see yourself in that situation, we are really stuck because something has to give. So if it comes to that, we need to think about what we are going to do in this situation. But I think what's important is that we are aware now that there is this new and quite stringent new Chinese export control and what it says, so we can start having a bit of more detailed look into what it means to our business. Do we need to ring fence part of our operation? Do we need to think about supply chain changes? Do we need to think about ensuring that Chinese products and American products don't mix, right? And also, how do we communicate, right? How do we share the cloud? How do we make sure that one person doesn't see what the other person does? And how on earth do we make sure we're not infringing on national security? So I know it's a generic answer, and I'm sorry I can't be more specific, but that's the first step.
Thank you, Arne, and thank you for the questions, everyone. I'm just going to quickly share the results to that poll. So about half of you do handle goods affected by US control law, 30% no, 15% not sure. Just do a couple more questions before we break off. Again, a few people have asked around people. This is a question from Francis, who says, we send our engineers to our company in China. Do they need to take extra precautions now?
Yeah, and this is a good question, because you've heard it, right? You've heard you become export operator when you deal with exports out of China. So if you send engineers there and you have controlled items that are controlled as per the Chinese law, then yes, of course, because now you are a foreign entity, and you've heard that deemed exports is a provision in the law, as I've just explained. So you can think of it, if it does need a control when you go to America, it will need a control, it's my interpretation of it, when you go to China. So the answer is yes, you now might need to get a license by MOFCOM in order to send your engineers to China, if it is that they are in any shape or form involved in in controlled items, in dealing with controlled items. And that also applies, don't forget, to when this engineer is still in the UK and accesses materials that are in China, be it on the cloud, being in blueprints, being in whatnot, and even jumps on a call to discuss this item. So I can't stress enough how we need to be extra careful when we consider this new law and the practical implication in the UK.
Thank you, Arne. And just one last question. We've had it from a few different people. It's a bit of a back to basics one, perhaps, but just kind of what sorts of goods are we talking about in terms of controls? A few people have asked, I export garments, footwear. Some people export technologies who have asked this question.
Of course, a very good question, right? So here I want to make sure that we understand, like in the UK, we call this strategic items. We call it dual use items if you want. So it's items that you could use for commercial purposes as well as for military purposes, but they're not your traditional, day-to-day commercial items. They are items that in the wrong hands could create a problem. They have very specific parameters. Usually, at least experience from the UK and US and EU shows, they are listed and they are named and they are specifically identified. So you would go to the list and you would find a very specific parameter for a product, for a machine part. This is not your everyday over-the-counter goods that you can buy. So the golden rule, I suppose, is if you can buy it on eBay, if you can buy it on Amazon, if you can buy it in a normal shop, then it's probably not export controls. I'd be very surprised if you can buy it online. Right? But if it is something that is either specifically modified for a specific customer who might have dealings with the military, or you're not sure exactly what he's going to do with it, and you are falling into these lists, these defined lists, then you do need a license. So that's why I said first step is maybe look at the list and see if you fall into this. Failing that, or not knowing if there is a list at all, you need to remember there's a catch-all clause that you need to think about. You need to think about the temporary list, of course, and then if the Chinese want to intervene, they will do that anyway.
Thank you, Arne. Thank you, everyone, for the questions. And just on that last question, we have done previous webinars on kind of the general basics of finding out if your goods are potentially controlled. So please do get in touch and we can forward you the links to that. But that's time, I'm afraid. So I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but if you do still have questions, please do get in contact with our a technical helpline, which you can find on export.org.uk. And we'd be more than happy to take those questions on if you are members of ours, and if not, get in touch to find out more about membership. If we move on to the last slide very briefly, just to say thank you once again to Arne for the presentation and the answers, and thank you as well, Roger, for joining us earlier. I hope everyone has found that useful. It's definitely a topic we will keep a close eye on. And as you will see in the last slide, here are some of the benefits of export control profession membership with the IOE, including various continual professional development opportunities and point system, training offers and opportunities, and a support network of your fellow export control professionals. So for more information, please go to exportcontrolprofession.co.uk. But for now, thank you everyone for tuning in. We hope you found this session useful. But for now, stay safe and see you on the next one. Thanks everyone.
Thank you guys. Bye-bye.